this morning, I want to just share a message with you. We're not starting a new series. That'll be next week. That's called Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. So we're going to look at things that often keep us from enjoying the holidays and really our life, dealing with forgiveness and hurt and criticism, our attitude, being complainers, just good stuff that we're going to dig underneath the surface. But this week, I've been excited for a couple months to share this message with you. I was reading just a few months back in the book of Numbers, and typically the book of Numbers I try to get through rather quickly because of all the details and things, and I get to Numbers 20, and the Lord really just dropped something in my heart. And first of all, I just was sharing it with people, and I thought, I cannot wait just to share this with the church. And I hope that it really ministers to you and blesses you on some level. And I really believe that it will, specifically to each and every one of you in some area of your life. And it's Numbers 20. We're going to take a look at verses 1 through 12. And so I want you to go with me. We'll read this, and then we'll kind of just break it down and talk for a bit. But Numbers chapter 20, verses 1 through 12. It says, in the first month of the year, the whole community of Israel arrived in the wilderness of Zin and camped at Kadesh. While they were there, Miriam died and was buried. Now, Miriam was the sister of Moses. There was no water for the people to drink at that place, so they rebelled against Moses and Aaron. The people blamed Moses and said, if only we had died in the Lord's presence with our brothers. Why have you brought us, the congregation of the Lord's people, into this wilderness to die along with all the livestock? Why did you make us leave Egypt and bring us here to this terrible place? This land has no grain, no figs, no grapes, no pomegranates, and no water to drink. Moses and Aaron turned away from the people and went to the entrance of the tabernacle, where they fell face down on the ground. And then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord said to Moses, you and Aaron must take the staff and assemble the entire community. As the people watch, speak to the rock over there. I like the specificity. They're in the wilderness. The rock over there, all right? Where? There. And it will pour out its water. You will provide enough water from the rock to satisfy the whole community and their livestock. So Moses did as he was told. He took the staff from the place where it was kept before the Lord. Then he and Aaron summoned the people to come together and gather at the rock. Listen, you rebels, he shouted. Must we bring you water from this rock? Then Moses raised his hand, struck the rock twice with the staff, and water gushed out, so the entire community and their livestock drank their fill. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to demonstrate my holiness to the people of Israel, you will not lead them into the land I'm giving them. This place was known as the waters of Meribah, which means arguing or strife. Because there the people of Israel argued with the Lord, and there he demonstrated his holiness among them. Now, I've read this story a number of times, and I've always thought that the punishment that God gave Moses was a little excessive. Anybody else? All right? One time that he doesn't do what God asks him to do, and he doesn't get to realize 40 years of leadership of these people and to take them into the promised land, he strikes the rock when God says, speak to the rock, and God says, sorry, Moses, you cannot finish the job. You won't be able to cross the line and get a touchdown. You won't be able to take it past the goal line and hit pay dirt because you struck the rock and you didn't speak to the rock. You didn't trust me. I've always thought, man, they're just right there. But if you look at the story and you really look at the backstory, you kind of understand a bit more. Sometimes what happens is we come to church and the pastor says, let's go to Numbers 21 through 12, and we forget there's context and story beforehand and years and years and years beforehand, and we're just kind of pulling the story out of thin air and trying to deal with 12 or 13 verses. And so if I can I take you back a little bit up into this moment, because I think it explains Moses' psyche and where he's at, and why he chooses to do what he does and why God gives him the punishment. So Moses is born as an Israelite or a Hebrew, and they are in Egypt, and they have been slaves in Egypt for about 400 years. They've been enslaved. And at this time in Egypt, the Hebrews are started to grow in number. They started to get so populated that the Egyptians got scared that they would overrun them. And so they decided, we're going to take every boy that's born as a baby and we're going to kill it. That way, we can keep the population suppressed and so they won't overthrow us. And they literally had a band of people that would go around house to house and when they found out they were having a baby, and if it was a boy, they would kill it. So Moses' mother decides that we're going to try to not have this happen, right? And so they kind of act as if it was a girl who was born, and they take the baby and they wrap him up and they put him in this basket, and his sister takes him out, Miriam, out into the water where there are a bunch of reeds and kind of hides him in the water. And one day, somehow, the basket seemingly gets away. I don't know if you've ever seen renditions of this. It's like the water just comes and takes the basket and it floats right up to the palace. We don't know what happened, but something happened to where the daughter of the king of Pharaoh finds this basket and pulls out the baby, knowing that it's a Hebrew, and she decides to keep it. And Moses' sister Miriam's a pretty quick thinker, and she goes, I know a woman who would be happy to nurse that baby. And so this deal was worked out that they took the baby home until he could be weaned off of milk, and he was returned back to the palace, and the woman that nursed Moses just happened to be his mother. But Moses grows up in the palace of Egypt as a Hebrew, and he grows up as a prince. And so he's born a Hebrew, but he talks like an Egyptian, walks like an Egyptian, acts like an Egyptian, right? He's a Hebrew and Egyptian. And one day, after about 40 years or so, he comes out and he sees an Egyptian soldier beating a Hebrew slave, and he gets so angry that he kills the Egyptian soldier, and then he buries him in the ground. And the next day he comes out and he's talking to the Hebrews, and they say, and he says something to them, and they say, oh, are you going to kill us and bury us like you did that Egyptian soldier? And thus begins an issue in Moses' life. Moses gets scared and he runs away. He runs out of the palace and he runs to the desert, and it's called this wilderness, and it's called Midian. And there he meets Jethro's daughter. Jethro's in the Bible. I don't know if you knew that. It's in the Bible, and he meets his daughters, and they report back to Jethro, and they said, we found an Egyptian who was nice to us. So they see that Moses is an Egyptian, and Moses never tells them he's a Hebrew. He spends 40 years in the wilderness of Midian. He marries one of Jethro's daughters. He becomes a shepherd. He goes from the palace to being a shepherd, hiding out in the wilderness. And one day he's walking out in the wilderness and he sees a bush that's on fire. Now, the amazing thing is not that the bush is on fire, because in that part of the world, things can spontaneously combust that because of the heat and how dry they are. The amazing thing to Moses is that the bush was not consumed by the fire. The miracle is not that the bush was burning. The miracle that the bush was burning, but it wasn't burning, if you know what I mean. And he walks over to it, and then he hears this voice, and it's God that is speaking to him. And God calls Moses and says, hey, you are not an Egyptian. You are a Hebrew, and I have called you and am anointing you to go back into Egypt and to set my people free. I find it interesting that Moses tried to run, but God called Moses to come right back and confront the things that he had buried in his life. That's just extra, okay? That's just extra. All right. Then what Moses does is he leads the children of Israel out of Egypt. He appears before Pharaoh, let my people go, da-da-da-da-da. They cross the Red Sea, all this great stuff. Then they get into the wilderness. So this is the last 40 years of Moses' life. 40 in the palace, 40 in the wilderness of Midian, and now 40 years leading the children of Israel to freedom, to this land that God had promised Abraham. Now, all of these details will come into play, okay? They'll come into play. I just want to kind of bring you up to speed. Moses, about the age of, 80, starts leading these children of Israel to the promised land. The journey should have been pretty short, but it ended up being 40 years. The first detail we find right here at the beginning of this chapter, it says that they're at Kadesh. Kadesh. Now, about 30 years prior or so, they're at Kadesh, and Moses sends out 12 spies into the land, the promised land that God had promised to give them. He sends 12 spies out. 10 come back and say, there's absolutely no way we can get in there. These people are huge. They're better armed than us. They are going to crush us. They're going to kill us. And you got Joshua and Caleb on the side saying, no, God promised this land to us. He's going to be faithful. He's going to deliver us. He's a miracle worker. He's a way maker. Even if we don't see it, we don't feel it, that kind of thing. They were singing that song back then. And the children of Israel, what they said is, we're going to believe the 10 over the 2, and they reject Moses and his leadership at Kadesh. Reject him. And they've watched God deliver them. They've watched God split the Red Sea, all kinds of stuff. They reject his leadership. Moses is at Kadesh again, a place of rejection. It also says towards the end of the chapter that he's at the waters of Meribah, which is the waters of strife and arguing. So he's at a place of rejection. He's at a place of strife. Now couple that with his sister has just died and he had to bury her. And he's exhausted. And on top of that, the people, like, we got no water to drink. We're dying. And they start questioning his leadership again. Why did you bring us out here, Moses? Why didn't you just leave us in Egypt? Because it was way better there. Oh, really? You cried out to God for 400 years to deliver you. And that happened, but it was way better there. We've got nothing here. They're just complaining. So much so is the burden and the stress that Moses and Aaron go to the tabernacle, fall on their face before God. What are we going to do? We're about ready to die in the wilderness again of thirst. And God says, his presence come. He says, now Moses and Aaron, stand up, take the staff. Moses had a staff, right? Because when God called Moses said, what am I going to do? What am I going to use? God said, Moses, what's in your hand? And he said, a staff. Take this staff, call the people. Now I got to preach the rest of the time holding this, so we'll see how that works. Call the people together and speak to the rock, and water will come forth. Moses takes the staff. It was in the tabernacle. It was before the Lord. He calls the people together, has the staff here. So because you got to understand, the staff of God by this point had become a symbol. The staff of Moses, a symbol of God's power and authority. All right? And he begins to speak to the people. And he says, listen up, you rebels. He's had it, right? He's done. Exhausted, tired, stressed, grieving, rejected. Must we, he looks at him and Aaron, must we bring water for you from this rock again? It's the third time they've been in the wilderness and he had to bring water. First time they were at waters that they couldn't drink, and God says, throw this in here and it'll make the water sweet, and he did. Second time, they're at a place where they don't have any water. God says, take the staff and strike the rock and water will come forth, and he did. This is the third time, but God says, don't strike the rock. What I want you to do is speak to the rock. But Moses says, listen, you rebels, must we, me and Aaron, not God, but must we do this for you again? And then he takes the staff and he twice on the rock, and water comes forth. That's a lot of details. It's a lot of details. But I think what we get from this story is this. There are patterns and behaviors in our lives that often keep us from entering into the promised land, everything that God has for us. Because of this one thing that Moses did, which isn't just one thing, as we'll discover, he wasn't able to go in the promised land. God says, because you didn't trust me enough to demonstrate my holiness, you can't go into the promised land. I think there are things in our lives that we consistently and constantly do. Maybe not, if I say consistent, maybe it's not habitual, maybe it's not every day, but things and patterns that we have developed that we're not necessarily aware of, that if we're not careful, can keep us from really experiencing the fullness of God in our life. Not because God isn't willing, not because God isn't able, but because like the children of Israel, we are unable to choose freedom. Unable or unwilling to really choose freedom. And I think the question in this story becomes is, how do we live our lives in such a way where we, unlike Moses, can learn to speak to the rock and not strike the rock? How can we, in the moments of being exhausted, of being stressed, of grieving, of intense pressure, how can we learn in those moments to trust God and not just do what we've always known? I felt like I could preach a whole series on this passage, and but I wanted just to kind of distill it down and give you 3 things to consider, okay? I think one of the first things that we have to do in our lives is we have to have the ability to recognize our circumstances. We have to have the ability to recognize what's going on around us and what's going on inside of us. There was a lot going on inside of Moses, externally and internally. He's in a place of rejection. He's in a place of strife. His sister has just died, and he had to bury her. That same sister that protected him and rescued him and took care of him and made sure he didn't die. It's the same sister that also rejected his leadership at various times in the wilderness. Aaron, his brother, his partner in crime, so to speak, also rejected and rebelled against his leadership. Moses has spent 40 years of leading people who continually want to go back to the place they wanted to get out of. Have anybody ever just been stressed by leading some people? Maybe you say, well, I'm not a leader. You got a family, you work. Have you ever just thought, you people are ridiculous. I don't know what to say to you anymore. I don't know what to do for you anymore. It's never good enough. And every time it gets hard, you're like, why did you bring us out here to die? Well, yeah, that's what I did. I just thought, I hate you that much that I want to bring you to a place and just watch you die. Think about the toll that takes on a person. And at this moment, because of this, what he's going through in a various number of things, Moses, out of anger, out of frustration, out of stress, out of exhaustion, looks at the people and he speaks to them in a way that he's not really spoken to them before. And he says, listen up, you rebels. Can't believe I got to do this for you again. Have you ever been in a situation where you would just say, you know what, I don't care what this person thinks. I don't care how they're going to feel. I'm going to tell them what I think. I've earned the right to let them have it. Anybody? And you may be right. You may be right. You're like, I have put up with enough. I am just going to rip into this person and I'm going to let them have it and it's going to feel so good, and it does for a moment, but it does more harm than it does good. That's where Moses is. You can see really what's going on. And we know that it's culminating to the moment where he disobeys the Lord and he strikes the rock twice. We have to be able to recognize what is going on internally, what is going on externally, to take a moment to step back and say, hey, why am I thinking like this? Why am I acting like this? Why am I feeling this? And maybe part of it would be I just need to get in some good counseling and get some help. But what happens is those patterns express themselves in moments of great exhaustion, of great stress, great insecurity, great grief. Just when we think that we are doing well, right, and we can handle it, a pattern emerges that we're not maybe even aware of, or maybe we were aware of, and we start to do what we know. Because it's worked. Because here's the thing, Moses struck the rock, and what happened? He got water. How interesting is that? We continue to do things because it works, or so we think. It delivers something in the moment, and it confirms, okay, yes, this is working. Yes, this is working. But here's the thing about dysfunction. We do what we know because there's a level of comfort, even if it's dysfunctional, right? Because if I repeat what I know, and I have a sense that it isn't right, it isn't good, it isn't helpful, it isn't beneficial, but I don't really know how to get to the other side of something that is functional, beneficial, and helpful, so I repeat what I know. Even if I don't want to, I do it. It's what I know. So having the ability to recognize the circumstances that we're in and processing our feelings, processing our actions, finding out that there's some things deeper in us that God wants to heal, right? That God wants to deliver us from. But do we take the opportunity to recognize it and be honest about it? And the second thing that we have to do as we start to process that is we have to be able to hold the past loosely. And I want you to understand what I mean. God told Moses to do something very interesting. He said, take the staff. Take the staff. But he tells him to take it, even though he's not going to use it. Which is like God tempting Moses. Why tell Moses to take it if he's not going to use it? But I wonder if, in some way, these are my thoughts, okay? If in some way God is saying, I want you to take what has been a visible marker of my power and my authority so that people can see it. Right? Has become, because this staff, when Moses threw it down, it became a serpent and consumed the other staff. This staff split the Red Sea, right? This staff, budded. This staff was always with Moses. When Moses struck the rock the first time, water came out. This staff seemingly had power, right? And every people associated, when God did a miracle for them, literally they could see it was the staff of Moses or the staff of Aaron. Some call it the rod of God. God says, take this and speak to that rock over there. I think in that moment, what maybe Moses failed to realize, and maybe what he assumed, and I'm just thinking here, that the power of God was in the staff. But the power of God was never in the staff. It was always in Moses being obedient. Because God can use whatever, whenever, whoever, however he wants to do. The staff had no magical powers. It was God choosing to use the staff in that moment and in those moments to demonstrate his power and his authority and his provision. But God tells Moses, take this and hold it in your hand and do something entirely different. I want you to speak. How often do we continue to do what we know because it's comfortable and it's safe and I can cling to it and I can hold on to it and I can say, this is what I know, this is what I see, I have a history with this. And it's some way comforting. But God is saying, I want you to do something different. I want you to do something new. I want you to trust me. I want you to hold what I've done in the past in one hand and look forward to the future and speak. And do something different. And I love the specificity of it. Moses, speak to that rock over there. Okay. Over there. I think sometimes over there is what's scary. Because I've been avoiding over there. Right? I don't want to go over there. I don't want you to go over there. I don't want you to talk about over there. Matter of fact, over there is not there anymore. Because I buried it. Because I buried it. See, Moses always struggled with anger. Out of anger, he killed the Egyptian soldier. Out of anger, he breaks the 10 Commandments when he sees the people acting a fool. Out of anger, he yells at the people. Now, I think his anger is justified. I'm just saying. But he continued to run from the thing that God wanted to set him free from. How do we hold the past in one hand and hold it loosely and say, hey, it used to work? And maybe it was a good thing. Maybe it was something God did in your life a number of years ago, and you can say, God, I thank you that you did that. But God is saying you continue to do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result when the power is not in what I did. It's in who I am. Methods change, right? God doesn't change. Methods change. Moses had that staff in his hand. This symbolized God's power, but God was saying, I'm doing something new. I want people to stop associating my power with just a staff and a man and something entirely different. Entirely different. Speak to that rock over there, Moses. Some of the Jewish historians and commentators believe that when Moses went over there to speak to the rock, he wasn't really sure which rock to speak to. And kind of the story goes as he's speaking to rocks and no water's coming forth and the people are crowding around because they're thirsty and they start making fun of him and they start jeering him and they start pressuring him saying, Moses, where's the water? What are you doing? Strike the rock, strike the rock. Can you hear the crowd? Strike the rock, strike the rock, strike the rock. You've done it before. And Moses is speaking and he's getting frustrated and finally he just goes, there's your water. Walks off. See, if we're gonna move forward, I think one of the things we also have to do is we have to be willing to embrace the unknown, right? To speak to the rock is to embrace something that I no longer have control over, because it was not out of faith that Moses struck the rock. It took no faith for him to do that because he had seen God do it before, and he was depending on what had happened and not on faith, the evidence of things, not seeing the substance of things hoped for. He didn't act out of faith, he acted out of anger and control, and not faith. He said, but he got water. That's because God loves the people and he didn't want them to die in the wilderness. God gave water because he's compassionate and full of grace, not because of Moses, but in spite of Moses. In spite of Moses. In spite of him. We have to be willing to say, you know what, God, you're asking me to do something that I'm not in control of. You're asking me to do something that I'm afraid of. You're asking me to do something that I have no guarantee that it's going to work. You want me to go to the rock over there and just speak to it? That's difficult. But he says, I want you to do it while you're holding the staff in your hand because I never want you to forget. What happened was never you doing it. It was never you in control. It was you trusting me. Because remember, Moses, when you said, what shall I say and what shall I do? I said, Moses, what's in your hand? And I anointed what was in your hand. Now I want to anoint what comes out of your mouth. And it's not what you do for these people, Moses. It's what I've done. I've just used you to deliver them. Can we embrace the unknown? Can we trust God that if he's leading us in a new direction, that he's not going to abandon us, and he's not going to hurt us, and he's not going to shame us, and he's not going to push us out to where we can be made fun of? People may say what they're going to say, but he is ultimately leading us into the best that he wants for us, into the promised land that he has for us, for our marriage, for our finances, in our interpersonal relationships with family or friends or whatever the case may be. God's saying, I want to break the patterns in your life, and I want you to adopt a new pattern and a new way of life, and it will be difficult. But you have to stop doing what you have done and start engaging with me in what I'm doing today. So many of us want to continue to stay back here. This is what I know. This is what I'm comfortable with. It's not always the best, but at least I know. And we're living here in the past rather than being in the present, moving forward to the future. And we do it in our relationships, right? We say, well, you've changed, and this is not who you used to be. And you're like, I'm wrong. That's right. I'm 30 years older than I was. I've changed. I don't do things the same way. Or have you ever looked at your finances every year when it's time to pay taxes, and you say, well, what happened? I keep doing what I've always done. If we always do what we've always done, we always get what we've always got. And yet we think, I'm going to keep doing it and get a different result, which we know that's the definition of insanity, right? But we're like, God, why aren't you blessing it? I keep doing the same thing. Exactly. I've moved on from that. You've got to do something different. And it may be scary. And it may be hard. Not maybe, it most likely will be. And you'll have to confront the issues and things in your life, things that happened to you, things that you did, things that you had no control over, whatever the case may be. God, like Moses, will march you right back up in front of Pharaoh and uncover the bodies that are buried in your life. Not to shame you, not to hurt you, but to set you free. To set you free. And you want to know the beautiful thing about Moses? You read later on, he knew that he wasn't going to lead the children of Israel into the promised land. So what he graciously did was he anointed Joshua as the next leader of Egypt, and he said, hey, God is faithful. God will be with you. Be strong and courageous. He will fight for you. Moses, he knew the heart of the Father. He knew who God was. He did not choose to abandon God in that moment because God did not abandon Moses. Although Moses could not lead them into the promised land, God took him up onto the mountain to show Moses. See, 4 months after Moses struck the rock, his brother died. So Moses buried his brother and his sister within 4 months of each other. He tells the children of Israel, he said, my 120 years are up. God takes him to the mountain. He oversees the promised land. God lets him see it with his physical eyes. And then it says that God buried Moses. We don't even know where Moses is buried. God buried him. And then we read throughout the book of Joshua the conquest of them going into the promised land. But here's the beautiful thing. Here's the beautiful thing. So many of us think that, Josh, I've struck the rock. I've kept striking the rock. Is God going to abandon me? And the question and the answer is an emphatic no. An emphatic no. Does he like that you strike the rock? No. But Moses did get to see the promised land. I want you to know that. You go to the New Testament and you read that when Jesus took Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration, there was 2 people that appeared on that mountain with him, and that was Elijah and Moses. Moses saw the promised land because he met Jesus, and the promised land was never about a place, it was always about a person, and it was Jesus. See, God in his grace said, Moses, you're not the one to lead them in, but you will see and you will receive the promised land because it's not contingent upon. And just because that is not greater than the grace of my son, Jesus Christ. See, the Bible always has layers. Always has layers. Jesus is called the rock of our salvation, isn't he? The rock. The Bible says that he would only be struck once for our sin. Struck once. When Moses struck the rock the first time, water came forth. It was symbolic of how Jesus would be struck for our sin, and then water would come forth. The second time, God says, speak to the rock out of faith, and water will come. Moses strikes twice. Jesus will never be struck more than once. There is no more sin or pain or punishment for Jesus to bear because he bore it all. And we only get into the promised land by faith, not by works. We don't earn it. It is by faith that we confess with our mouth and believe in our hearts that he is the Lord, right? Saved by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. It's by faith. By faith. I would ask you this morning, what staffs are you holding in your hand that you continue to use that God is saying, speak to that rock over there. Go over there. Go over there. Because if we don't, we'll spend the rest of our lives going, getting a little, getting a little, getting a little. When God is saying, speak, trust me. It's hard. Have faith. I'm a way maker. I'm a miracle worker. Even when you don't see it, even when you don't feel it, I'm working and I'm not in the staff anymore. My power does not reside in an inanimate object. It resides in the person of my son, Jesus Christ. But here's the trick. We go back to Kadesh, the first Kadesh. Moses sends out 12 spies. 12 spies into the land. Only 2 come back with a positive report. 10 come back with a negative report. Isn't that kind of how it is in life? The negative reports fill our ears. 10 come back and say, no, you can't. God is not in it. He's not going to take care of us. We're going to be destroyed. It's going to be hard. And you got 2 off to the right saying, no. God is faithful. If he promised it, he will do it. He will provide. But the 10 are like, no way. We're afraid. We have so much fear. It seems to me like I got to fight really hard to listen to the 2. Because the overwhelming amount of people are saying negative things, confirming my suspicions, confirming my fears, whatever the case may be. But faith listens. Faith hears. Faith responds. Even when I don't see it, even when I don't feel it, even if I don't know what rock is over there, I'm going to speak and water will come forth. So if you have been striking the rock in here today, I've got good news for you. God's grace is sufficient for you. It is sufficient for you. But don't run. Don't run. Don't run back to what you've known. Don't run back to the way you've always done it. Run straight in to the arms that he has for you. He wants to heal you and forgive you and set you free. See, we believe here that God is moving you from where you're at to where he wants you to be, and he wants you to know him. He wants you to find freedom. He wants you to discover your purpose, and he wants you to make a difference. But in order to do that, you got to be moving forward, and you got to move forward in faith and not with what you know. Let God redeem you. Let God take you back to heal you. Let God unearth the things that you've buried so that he can produce that inner healing and that inner work in you. And if whatever, maybe you need to go to counseling to engage in that process, whatever the case may be, you do what God leads you to do. But I'm here to tell you that's who he is. You cannot run too far because he will chase you down. And he'll pull you back. And he'll give you the opportunity. But here's the thing you need to understand about the God that we serve. This is difficult. When that generation of Israelites rejected him in the wilderness and said, we choose to believe the 10 over the 2, God says, I now understand at this moment that you're never going to be in the promised land because you don't want to be free. I've done everything that I needed to do. I've set you free. I've delivered you. I've provided for you. I've fed you. But you're not free here. He let them die in the wilderness, not because he's bad, but because he never violates our will. Freedom is yours to choose. It's already been given. It's already been provided. The question is will you choose to be free and to live free. God doesn't violate our will. It's there for the taking. It's there for the receiving.